In this video, we're going to take a look at implementing a system that handles scenarios, dynamic events, and general player progress throughout a game. If you think of like an RPG game, or say you go up and talk to an NPC and he says, hey, you need to go do this thing. And then you walk over and you go do the thing, and then you come back and talk to that same NPC again, he should say something else this time, right? Because you've already completed the thing. So you might be thinking, isn't that just a simple if-else kind of thing? If I've done this, say this, but if I haven't done that, say that. And at the very core, yes, that's absolutely what's going on. But those kinds of manual coding checks don't scale very well. So as you keep adding events to your game, it can be a pain to go in there and manually code the logic for each specific event, and can totally lead to human oversight bugs. And especially, again, when your game hits a certain size, it's a real pain to go back and edit that kind of stuff. Because it's not fresh in your mind. So having a system like the one I'm going to show you today helps abstract all of that decision-making away, so you can just focus on making content for the game. When we were making our game Danger Crew, which is a 6 to 7 hour RPG game, we quickly found we needed this kind of thing because there's a lot of events and a lot of content in it. And so today I'm going to show you the exact thing that we used for Danger Crew. You're welcome to take it, fork it, make it your own, change it to serve your own needs. The link, as always, is in the description. So here's the quick demo I made for the purpose of this video. See, we have a little scene here. I called it Good Boy, and you have a dog and some robbers. The robbers have taken the toys from the dog, which is awful, and so our job is to rescue the toys. You see that at the bottom of the screen there's a prompt. It says rescue the toys, and as I click on the toys to rescue them, the prompt changes. And so what we're doing here is emulating a user or a player completing tasks, and then the output of the game changing because of the player's current state. And you might think like, okay, again, isn't that just like an if-else thing? But there's some nuance here. And so check this out. If I take the blue toy first, the prompt says this is a good start. But if I put it back and take the bone first, it says, yes, the bone. And so imagine cases where, what happens if I've completed A and B but not C? What happens if I've completed A and B or C? We see another example here. If we have two toys, the dog says, this is good, but have you seen the rabbit? I really like the rabbit. The rabbit's in the top corner. So I'll put these two toys back, and if I have two toys but one of them's the rabbit, the output changes. So glad we have the rabbit. And again, this is the kind of thing that comes up in kind of story-driven RPG games where you need to show a specific message or have a outcome that's really specific to what the user's done, that can be a lot more complicated than just how many toys do we have. So the two main pieces that we're dealing with here are called story points and scenarios, and you can rename either of those for your project if you don't like those names. But a story point is simply a flag that you've done something. And so in my code here, I represent them as strings. And so you see that there's a story point called one toy. If I open up the HTML, the way this demo works is when you click on one of these toy elements, it will look up the story point attribute and then add that to your list of collected story points. And so you see that the story point is just called bone. It's real simple. It's exactly what it is. There's ball, rubber, and rabbit. And then there's another piece here too, where if you look down, we have story points, which is a list of things that we can accomplish. But then the other side to it is scenarios, which are what happens when I have certain story points. So here's an example of a scenario. It's just a little data structure. Here I have an object, and each one of these objects has a required field, bypass field, and then text. And the required and bypass, those are both arrays of story points. So see, if we look at our first scenario here, this is the one when we first start up the demo. We don't require any story points to see this one, but we do bypass it as soon as we have one toy. And so if our current story point situation is valid, meaning that we have all the required ones, and we don't have any of the bypass ones, then we're going to show this text. And so the text that you get just lives right on the scenario. So as I go down the list, you can see that the scenarios start to get a little bit more complicated. So if we take a look at some of those rabbit cases, if you remember, you have two toys, but the dog really wants the rabbit. He'll ask for the rabbit, but if you have two and one of them's already the rabbit, he'll be glad for the rabbit. And so you can see that these two right here kind of control that. Or if I work backwards for a second, if we have two toys, but not three toys, we're going to default to the rabbit situation. But the other scenario says if you have two toys, not three toys, but you also have the rabbit, then we want to show the case where the dog asks for the rabbit. Now, one thing you might notice here is that if you look at our HTML, the only 4 story points we can acquire as the player are the toys: bone, ball, rubber, rabbit. But if you look in our scenarios, we have a few different ones here that say things like 1 toy and 2 toys. So where do those come from? Those are what I call computed story points, where sometimes we need, and here's the data structure, what it looks like. It's a list of story points that are grouped together. So in this case, just all 4 of our toys, and then some quantities. And the quantities kind of validate that if you have one of this group, then you'll get this story point, 1 toy. And they just simply increment from there. And so I found that this kind of helps make the scenarios a little bit more readable. Just like if you have 2 toys and one of them is rubber, then do this. But you could set this up however you want. You see the next block under here is just simple click events that we're setting up. And so all I'm doing is looping through each toy in the scene. And then as I click on one, it'll toggle the rescue class. In the CSS, there's, if I open it up, there's like all the positions and stuff, and then also a rescued version of the position. And so that's why as I click, the toy will bounce to the dog. That's just specific to this demo. That's sort of irrelevant of the story point thing. But one thing you can see is that after you, when you click on one, it toggles that class name, and then it also runs through a function called toggle story point that we'll look through in a second, passing in the story point to toggle, and then finally refresh this scenario, which will update the prompt on screen. Okay, here's the meat. The core concept that we're dealing with is a bucket of story points. These are the ones that you've collected as the player. And so here I'm representing that as an object. You could use an array too if you want. The object can be a little bit cleaner for modifying it. And we have that function, toggle story point, where we pass in a story point, and it's as simple as this. If we have the story point already, we're going to delete that key from the object. Otherwise, if we don't have it, we're going to go ahead and add it. So as we add story points, the object will kind of start to look like story point name true. And then looking it up is as simple as asking like, hey, do we have the key in this object? Okay, so now we have our mechanism for kind of turning story points on and off as we collect them. But the next piece is factoring in those computed ones. And so what we have next is a function that says get all known story points. And so what that's going to do is combine the story points that we already have with the ones that we can compute that we have, because they're the weird like quantity combinations of different things. So if we have the bone and the circle toy, the rubber circle toy, we also want to have 2 story points. Like we have 2 of the toys. This gives us more flexibility for more like intricate storytelling. Okay, so let's walk through this this thing here. And what I'm going to do is grab the data structure so we're looking at it side by side with the function. Let's see. Okay, so here's what computed story points looks like. It's got that required array, and then quantities, which define how many do we need, and then which story point do we get if we have that many. And so the first thing we're going to do is figure out how many of the acquired story points in the group that we have. And so what this says is a new variable called acquired count. We're going to take the computed story points, look at the required array within the structure there, and then filter it down to only ones that exist inside the story points object. And so filter will return true or false based on the function that you pass in. And so here we're just checking, does it exist? Kind of banking on that truthy value to come back. And then, so this much after the filter will give us an array, and then we simply check the length of the array. So if we have 3 of them, it would just be a number of 3. Finally, we're going to start a new bucket called the computed ones. And then looping through each of the quantities here, we can compare that length number to the requirement. And so the first, this code is, I'd probably go back and rename these to be better names, but for the purposes of the demo, I kept it kind of short. But what we're saying here is if your acquired account, which we counted up here, is greater than or equal to the first value in each of these little subarrays, then you can go ahead and toggle the second parameter, or the second member of the array, which is Q1, to true. Anyway, at the end of that, we basically have the same kind of object that's going to be 1 toy true, 2 toys true. And then if we don't have 3 or 4 toys, they just won't be in the object. Finally, this function returns, like I said before, that mashed up group of story points we already have plus all the computed ones. And so anytime we need to check which story points we have, we want to make sure that we use this function rather than just looking at the raw story points, because they wouldn't have the computed stuff. We've got one more piece to talk through, and I'm going to grab one of these scenarios up here. So again, we have kind of the schema to look at as we talk through this function. So this one's called refresh scenario. And it's a little bit tethered to the purpose of this demo, but the idea is that we're going to run this function, which will look at the story points we have, compare them to the list of scenarios that we have, and then pull out the correct thing. And then once we have one, we'll update the text on the screen. And so here we go. Here's a scenario. If you remember, it's got a required array, a bypass array, and then the kind of the guts, the text, what we get out of it if it's the valid one. So first, all we're going to do is run that function that we walked through before, get all known story points. So known is now going to be an object of all the story points we have, both the natural ones and the computed ones. And then finally, we're going to pull out the relevant scenario from the list by running the list through find, which find, if you're not familiar with it, it will iterate through an array, and then based on the function you pass in, it will return the first valid match, whatever the member of the array is. So we get, in this case, we'll get an object back, which is going to be one of our scenarios. Now, all we need to do in this find function is determine is this the relevant scenario based on our current story points. And so what we do first, we're going to check for the bypass story points. And so if we have any of the story points in the bypass list, we're going to immediately return false and break out of this find, or break out of this one in the find, so it'll start checking the next one. And so the code for that is just a simple kind of for loop through an array. Again, because of the abbreviations, it can look a little bit hard to glance at, but we're going to loop through each story point in the bypass array, and then if our known list has the current bypass story point that we're iterating through, we're going to immediately return false, and that will invalidate this scenario and move on to the next one. So in theory, we get through this entire loop and determine that we don't have any of the bypass story points, so we're good. Now we just need to check that we have all of the required story points. And so that code is a lot cleaner, a lot nicer. It's just checking that required list within the scenario, which again is up here. And then in JavaScript, we have this nice array method called every, which will check that this function is true for every member in our array. And so all we're doing again is grabbing the known list, checking if this key exists on the known list. And so if we have every single story point in that list, we'll return true here, which will then make our scenario, which again, at the very top, we said scenario equals whatever we find. So scenario will just be that object. Scrolling up again, it'll just be like one of these required bypass text, etc. So so theoretically, we have a scenario at the end of all that. Now this is the game code to use the scenario. And so in our case, we're just updating the text down here with whatever scenario.text is. I would tell you in a real game, what we did in Danger Crew is actually a little bit more complex, where we didn't just have text. We actually had events coming back on the scenario, and the events were like, walk to this position, say this thing, anything you need to kind of puppet a cutscene around. Those would all live on the scenario object itself, and then we'd pull it from there and then use it. Okay, so circling back to come full circle here. Again, if we just look at these click handlers again, all we're doing is every time you click on one of the toys, we're going to toggle the story point that the toy holds and then refresh the scenario, which will do all the magic of looking up the right scenario and then updating the scene with the guts of the scenario. So that's it for this video. The system we walk through here might seem like a little bit of overkill for just such the simple demo that we're looking at, but we found it to scale really, really well when making a longer story-driven game. So I hope you got some value out of this. As always, like, subscribe, all that. If you want to see more of these, I got a few more ideas coming up, but also let me know if you have a specific thing you'd like me to cover. Just comment or whatever. So anyway, that's it for today. Thanks a bunch, and I'll see you soon.